The first part of our work on the letter to the Hebrews is to look at some introductory topics. First of all, the title of the book. I'm sure that you understand that the word Hebrews, which comes at the top of your letter or even at the top of every page in your Bible, is not a part of the original document. Those titles were added to the books sometime in the 2nd century mostly, I think. Neither is there, as there is in Mark, an opening verse which serves as a title and which says that it's addressed to Hebrews people. That traditional title simply comes from the fact that the letter is clearly addressed to Christians who must have had a profound grounding in Hebrew, otherwise what it says in this letter will have gone straight over their heads. So the next question to ask is, did Paul write this letter? There are some quite old copies of Hebrews which have a title claiming that it was written by Paul, and the reasons for thinking that it's by Paul are really, I suppose, twofold. One is Paul was the arch letter writer of the New Testament, and the other is that Hebrews is quite complex in its language and reasoning, and that reminds you of the mental demands made on you as you read, for instance, Romans. But there are plenty of reasons for thinking that Paul did not write it. Some are centred around the distinctive ideas found in Hebrews, and the most quotable one is Hebrews chapter 11, where faith is defined as the substance of things hoped for, which appears to mean the ability to hold on even when you can't see the outcome of the line of action to which you're committed. In Paul, faith, however, is principally a trusting relationship with the Lord, and I can't see how Paul would have written Hebrews 11. And then no one who's studied the New Testament in Greek would be at all inclined to say that Paul wrote Hebrews, because the demands of the Greek language in Hebrews are much greater than in the letters of Paul. Much more sophisticated kind of upper crust language. And the other thing is that there are other candidates that people have suggested as the author to the Hebrews, and some of those suggestions go back to very early days. Well, I'm going to assume that Paul was not the author. I'm not going to advance any theories as to who was the author, but I will say that the way that people who defined what books should be in the New Testament did include the idea that they were especially keen to include books which had been written by apostles. For some decades into the 2nd century, many churches, however, did not include Hebrews in their list of books that were genuinely in, because so many people denied that it was from Paul, and there was no agreement as to any other apostle who might have written it. So this book didn't have the sort of priority entrance ticket. It was written by an apostle, therefore it ought to be counted as in. So it was held back, at least partly, on account of the doubts as to who wrote it. Let's look at the claims of the Old Testament law. What sort of laws are there in the Old Testament? I think it's fair to speak of them as being in two main categories. Those governing personal and social behaviour, I suppose we could label those as moral laws, and those directing worship, especially worship involving sacrifice. As for the first category, the moral laws, it's Paul who helps us with his teaching on justification by faith. What that amounts to is that the Old Testament moral law is not an exam that we have to pass in order to prove ourselves acceptable to God. It is rather a set of guidelines as to how the Lord wants his people to behave, and those guidelines can help us to spot what the Holy Spirit is doing in our lives and help him. They give us clues as to how we would like our lives to develop in order to please the Lord. But what about the worship laws? What about specifically the laws which require sacrifice? There are page upon page of commandments about what the Lord's people are required to do by way of sacrifices in order to deal with the gulf between us and Lord. And if you take your help from someone like Matthew, he'll tell you that it's the Lord's intention that not one jot or tittle of the law will be changed. I'm thinking of Matthew 5:18. The whole thing is laid upon us, even upon us who follow Jesus. Well, that's bad, because I'm sure you don't abide by all those sacrifice laws any more than I do. And it's the letter to the Hebrews that helps us here. The main thesis of the book, I'm going to go over it now, but we'll look at bits of it in more detail as we go through the book. Start with the assumption that sacrifice was God's properly provided means for his chosen people to reach out to him. And as they reached out, they would be turning away from the sin in their lives. That is, the provision of this means of turning to the Lord is in some way a provision of God's grace. Start too with the assumption that sacrifice was good. It did enable people to turn away from their sinful lives and re-establish some sort of contact with the Lord. Hebrews' main criticism of this process is drawn, in fact, from the Old Testament itself, that the Old Testament regulations require these sacrifices to be repeated regularly, several of them annually. And that means that at best, the good effect of the sacrifices only lasted a year. Now, the effect of Old Testament sacrifices depended on the logic behind them. What was really wanted of the people was that they should offer to the Lord their own lives, perfect in every detail. And it was a gracious concession by the Lord to allow them to show their intention of such an offering by giving him an animal sacrifice, making sure that the animal at least was perfect of its kind. So at least a perfect life was being offered, even if it was only a perfect animal's life. And remember, their idea about the animal's life was that it resided in the animal's blood, so that when the animal's blood was shed on the altar, at that point they saw its life as being offered to the Lord. Now, against that background, Hebrews portrays Jesus as the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. There's one little four-letter word, hapax. If you think about hapax, I'm sure you think it needs 5 letters in English to say that. Well, so it does. But the H at the beginning is not a letter in Greek. It's just an indication that you're supposed to do a at the beginning of the word. There's 4 Greek letters in the word hapax. And that's usually translated once and for all. The sacrifice of Jesus was offered just the once and was effective for all people of all time. Now, it could be that effective because the only perfect human being who had ever lived had offered his life, even shedding his own blood. And the level of perfection there totally eclipsed the blood of a mere bull or goat, and that sacrifice was therefore in a class of its own. And because of that, the sacrifice of Jesus had an effectiveness in a class on its own, so good that it did not need to be repeated every year. It was effective, in fact, for all people of all time. So the sacrifice to end all sacrifices, there's 2 senses of that expression. One is that it was in a class of its own, and the other is that it genuinely did put an end to the need for sacrifices to be offered. From the point of view of the demands of the Old Testament law, that means that the sacrifice requirements of that law have been perfectly fulfilled in Jesus, and that no further sacrifices are needed. It's been done. And that puts us in the privileged position that we can agree with Matthew that no part of the Old Testament law is to be changed or removed, and we're relieved of the need to obey all those sacrifice laws ourselves, because Jesus has already done everything necessary. Let's turn to look at Eucharistic worship today. The three main communions of the Church, the Orthodox, Catholic and Anglican communions, all share a view of what happens in the communion service. The person who presides is referred to as a priest because he's someone authorized to conduct sacrifices. The table at which he provides is called an altar because that's where sacrifices are made. And their understanding is that when the priest offers the bread and the wine on the altar, not least when he breaks the bread, the sacrifice of Jesus is being performed again in the presence of the Church. In the full-blown Catholic understanding, the bread and the wine actually are the body and blood of the Lord, even though they still look and taste like bread and wine. In our sort of church, we don't agree with that sort of way of describing it. The New Testament says that the sacrifice of Jesus was offered once and for all. That means it is not something to be repeated. In the communion service, therefore, there's no need to describe the presiding person as a priest. There's no need to refer to the table at which it's done as an altar. Better to say that in the drama of the breaking of bread and the pouring of wine, the sacrifice of Jesus is being portrayed, not done again, but portrayed. And by means of that portrayal, we're helped to stay in touch with the sacrifice which happened once and for all. Better to say, too, that when we receive the bread and the wine, it is bread and wine that we're receiving. But that's dramatizing the way that we constantly receive Jesus into our lives. And if that drama can help even sinners like us to notice that Jesus is again offering himself to us, then it's doing a great thing. And if, too, it can communicate that in a way that mere words can't, or even words and music, then again, it's very much to be welcomed. Well, that ends our first episode in the letter to the Hebrews. The second part of our study of Hebrews will be to survey the content of the letter in the first 7 chapters. But before we do that, there are 3 psalms that I think it would be very useful for you to read, and that's Psalms 2, 8 and 110. If you'd like to read those and then come back to me, that'll make some bits of what we have to say ring the appropriate bells for you. So, in Hebrews itself, the very first verse, our forefathers mentioned in that first verse implies that the letter is addressed to Jewish Christians. In the first 4 verses, notice the high Christology, the very developed things that Hebrews says about Jesus, and that's typical of the book. In verses 5 to 13, we have a very rabbinical style of using Old Testament gobbets, and that style continues throughout the letter. Each gobbet is pulled out of its original context, and it's as if the letter writer is saying what it really means is. Now, some of these gobbets have a natural path from their original context to the application that the letter makes to Jesus. For instance, Psalm 110 starts life presumably as an enthronement psalm for a Hebrew king, especially in later years when they didn't have kings anymore. It was taken by the Jews themselves as referring to the Messiah and to his enthronement, and it's a very easy thing therefore for a writer like the writer to the Hebrews here to apply the psalm to Jesus. But for other gobbets it's a more awkward jump to make. For instance, if you look at Deuteronomy 32 verse 43, "Rejoice, O nations, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants. He will take vengeance on his enemies and make atonement for his land and people." But if you look in Hebrews 1:6, you will probably see a footnote there that points out that in the Septuagint, the Old Greek translation, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the verse that Hebrews is quoting here is Deuteronomy 32:43, but it bears little resemblance to what's in our Bibles at that point, the way that the Hebrews is reading this verse as meaning the angels, and it wrenches it out of worshipping God into worshipping the Son. There doesn't seem to be any obvious progress through this path, but it's typical of how the rabbis of the day used their scriptures. And the writer to the Hebrews is doing a typically rabbi-style way of using the Old Testament. Chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. The old system was based on messages from God, as Hebrews says, via angels. Remember, angels just means messengers. And was regarded by the Jews as binding and non-negotiable. The new thing that God has done in Jesus eclipses that old system. No way should we ignore it. I mean, verse 4, the role of signs that Jesus did, the letter here using the same word that John's Gospel uses to refer to some of the wonderful things that Jesus did. And signs and wonders, the wonders word is more typical of the three synoptic Gospels. Even the work of the Holy Spirit in Christians today confirms the Gospel. Now in verses 5 to 8 of chapter 2, we come to a bit that's based on Psalm 8. Mankind is only one stage lower than the angels. Whether you think of us getting there via God creating every species separately or via some sort of evolutionary process, this is where we've arrived at, and that always has been God's intention. And God has put all things under mankind's feet. This is quite clearly as yet incomplete. And I think this gives us a bit of a hint that the coming of Jesus may have some sort of relevance to the completion of this process. Verses 9 to the end of the chapter in chapter 2 are about the incarnation. Verse 9, Jesus was made a little lower than the angels. That is, he became man, sharing our status of being one lower than the angels. Now he's been returned to his rightful place, in some senses as a reward for his faithfulness even to suffering death. Verse 17. His full sharing in this human condition was necessary for him to stand in our place in the matter of atonement. And Hebrews sees atonement as the work of a high priest, echoing the established Jewish practice that on the Day of Atonement each year, just the high priests entered the Holy of Holies, where they understood was the place that God lived on earth. Verse 18 is a much more mundane remark, but it's theologically massive. In the early centuries of the Church, there was a regular fight to establish the faith that Jesus was a real human being as well as genuinely God. In fact, it was still a real issue of debate when in the year 451 a council of bishops was convened in Chalcedon, which is now a district in Istanbul, and there it was formally agreed that to be fair to the New Testament witness, we had to say that Jesus was fully God and fully man. The beginning of chapter 3. If Jesus features in that sort of way in God's plans, then our approach to life must also be Jesus-centered. Verses 2 to 6. If in the old system people could revere Moses, now we ought even more to revere Jesus. It's the monkey and the organ grinder, isn't it? I mean, or as Hebrews says, the faithful servant outclassed by the faithful Son of God. Verses 7 to 19. It's very easy to pull out of the Old Testament quotes which show how Israel failed to revere Moses and to implement his laws. Don't let that happen to our reverence for Jesus. Chapter 4, the first 11 verses, Hebrews uses selected Old Testament quotes to refer to Israel entering the Promised Land as they're entering into God's rest. Quotes come also which warn that some, by their behaviour, will be disqualified from entering that rest. And then he pulls that over into the New Testament context as a warning stroke encouragement that we should not forfeit our rest. Verses 12 and 13, Hebrews has given them warnings as applications of the written word, so he muses on the power of God's word to get into the depths of your life, to separate truth from falsehood, faithfulness from revolt. This is God's judgment. In the Greek, that's the word krisis, the basis of our word crisis. Two words in Greek are screaming to be allowed to work together. Krisis and ktisis. They differ in one letter only, and the one means judgment, the other means creation. Krisis is about God dividing mankind in two, separating the in-group from the out-group. The warning, therefore, is don't try mucking about with him, because he can perform that surgery on the basis of what he finds deep inside you. And as your creator, as the one who performed the ktisis, he is invariably involved in your krisis, in your judgment. Chapters 14 to the end of the chapter, in chapter 4, let these warnings make you tremble occasionally, but don't let them put you off. There is a remedy for the predicament that we find ourselves in, and that remedy is Jesus. He has entered fully into the mess of human life and has survived, and even he has gone before the Father on our behalf. Chapter 5, the first 4 verses, a description of the high priest under the old system. And then in 5 to 10, God has appointed Jesus to this role as high priest. You can see how during his earthly life he exercised this role through his intercessory prayers. Melchizedek is mentioned here, but he's mentioned again in chapter 7, and that's where I want to have my say about Melchizedek. I won't mention him anymore here. Chapter 5, verse 11 through to 6, verse 3. In his pastoral relationship to his readers, the writer knows that some of this is going straight over their heads, but it ought not to. It's what our Christianity is based on. It's very basic stuff. Chapter 6, the first 2 verses. In a less gospel-centred church than the one that I belong to, I've had cause to muse on how few people in the congregation would regard these sort of things as elementary. Don't forget, elementary means consisting of those basic elements from which our whole life is made up. And without those elements being in place, you can't build the Christian life with them. Verses 4 to 6, Hebrews argues that apostates cannot be restored. Well, I'm not so sure. I think that the parable of the prodigal son says that they can be. I'll back the prodigal son parable, I think. It would nonetheless be a severe putting of the Lord your God to the test if you ever allowed yourself to wander off, relying on the thought that you could come back again sometime when it suits you. That would be putting yourself in peril, I think. Verses 7 and 8, you are designed to be faithful, to be growing renewed and restored lives and spirit-filled ministries in place of your old lives. So make sure that is what you do. Verses 9 to 12, other people need this warning more than you do, of course, but I'm saying it to you just in case. I think there's a bit of a nudge, wink in there, that he knows that it's not a waste of time saying it even to the people who are going to be reading this letter. And then the remainder of chapter 6. Our salvation is rooted in God's promise to Abraham, which God swore on oath, and that must mean that he meant it, and he will stick to it. Verse 19, some people have referred to this verse 19 as Hebrews cogito, the thought upon which everything else can be built up. And then chapter 7, which brings us back to Melchizedek. Before the writer develops his main theme about sacrifice, he sets the stage by presenting Jesus as the great high priest. And there are several elements to this presentation, not the least of which is meditating on Psalm 110 verse 4, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." Psalm 110 reads like an enthronement psalm for a Hebrew king, which went way over the top in proclaiming that this new king was ex officio taken into the position of being Son of God. It was a psalm then crying out to be reinterpreted in later years as referring to the Messiah. Well, there's an obvious problem if you're going to present Jesus as a high priest. That is, he didn't belong to the right family or even to the right tribe. You had to be of the tribe of Levi to be a priest, and if you were going to get anywhere in your priestly career, you really needed to be a descendant of Zadok the priest, or at the very least of Aaron, Moses' brother. Well, the thing about Melchizedek was that he was king and priest in Salem, the town on which Jerusalem was later built, and he was there generations before the tribe of Levi was even born. He wasn't a descendant of Abraham, and yet the patriarch Abraham recognized him as priest and paid tithes to him. So he was a copper-bottomed priest because Abraham said so, and he didn't have to be a Levite. And the writer to the Hebrews takes this up avidly as the means of describing Jesus as a priest. And the fact that Melchizedek was both king and priest, of course, is a bonus, because so is Jesus. In chapter 8, he goes on to show how this priest, independent of the main line of Old Testament priesthood, is also independent of the Old Covenant. He ministers as high priest under the new covenant prophesied by Jeremiah, a covenant dependent not on human tradition and obedience, but on the direct intervention of God himself. But here he adds the thought that high priests are appointed for life. When they die, a new regime must begin. Some laws lapse and must begin again. Those, for instance, about the cities of refuge, we know, lapsed upon the death of the high priest. But according to Psalm 110, applying that to Jesus, that says that his appointment was not for life, it was forever. Verse 26, you couldn't have a better quality high priest. And verse 27, this one doesn't have to offer sacrifices for his own sins because he's sinless. And the sacrifice that he made of himself on the cross was hapax. It was once and for all, and we're included in the all that it was for. Praise God. In the third part of our looking at Hebrews, we're scanning the content from chapter 8 to the end. First of all, the first 6 verses of chapter 8. Jesus, the high priest, performs his offices in the heavenly tabernacle. The tabernacle and temple of the old system were at best a pale copy of the true sanctuary in heaven. What Jesus does, therefore, is a whole lot more real and a whole lot more effective than what was possible to achieve under the Old Covenant. And the rest of chapter 8, Hebrew quotes the New Covenant passage from Jeremiah 31, but tops and tails it with a logical remark. In verse 7, he says that had nothing been wrong under the Old Covenant, no new covenant would have been necessary. And in verse 13, the new covenant renders the old covenant obsolete, and what is obsolete, of course, should graciously bow out. The first 10 verses of chapter 9, a reminder of the old tabernacle and its routine, and then verses 11 to 14, Jesus, the high priest, offered not the blood of bulls and goats, but his own blood, and did so in the Holy of Holies in heaven. Therefore his sacrifice is much more effective than those of the old covenant. Verse 15, his sacrifice is then able to initiate the new covenant. 16 to 24, covenants are always sealed with blood, and the new covenant is no exception. And the final verses of chapter 9, Christ's sacrifice is not repeated annually because, guess what, it is hapax, it is once and for all. Chapter 10 then, the first 4 verses. The Old Testament law is only an earthly foreshadowing of the final revelation of God. So sacrifices made under that law could only be for the time being. Verses 5 to 10, the quote from Psalm 90 sounds like Amos. Psalm 40, I mean. Sounds like Amos. Sacrifices are not the be-all and end-all of the Lord's will for his people, so it's of little consequence if the sacrificial system of the Old Testament is done away with, provided, of course, it's replaced by something better, which it is. Verses 11 to 18, Jesus makes the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. Verse 18 itself, if the new covenant is now in force, and under it God is forgiving people's sins, there is no longer any need for further sacrifices which are designed to deal with people's sin. It's already been dealt with. Verses 19 to 25, a further bold step. Jesus has entered the heavenly Holy of Holies by his blood, and by his blood we are brought into the new covenant. Yes, we're bought by it as well. So now there's nothing stopping us from entering that Holy of Holies as well. Therefore we must, and we must do so boldly laying claim to our privilege under the new covenant. Otherwise it will look as if we don't appreciate it. And verse 24, let this spill over into our renewed lifestyles, encouraging and upholding us in that. And 25, not least for the purposes of encouraging each other, we must meet regularly, committed to each other as to the Lord. Some churches refer to this as the church covenanting together. Others see that as an overuse of the sacred notion of covenant, and they fight shy of using the word in this context. The remainder of chapter 10, those who fall away from this covenant are in a dangerous position, because there are no further sacrifices to be made for them. So keep up your confidence. Don't lose the enthusiasm of the first flush of faith. Chapter 11 is a paean to faith. Verse 1 has a definition which is moving over into something into the direction of that schoolboy howler that faith is believing what you know ain't true. This is the kind of definition of faith you might come up with if you have to produce a student essay comparing faith and reason as means of your knowing things. It's much closer to a definition of what Paul calls hope than of what Paul calls faith. So Paul treats faith primarily as a relationship with the Lord, and he could not possibly have written this verse. Verses 3 to 38 is the famous catalogue of heroes of faith, and the last couple of verses of the chapter, all this heroism, yet none of them entered into the new covenant, which was in their days at most a promise. Even their great stories are tales of people still waiting for the real thing. Chapter 12, the first 3 verses. Since we freely have the opportunity to enter into what was withheld from those heroes, let's go for it. And the key to doing so is to fix our eyes on Jesus and to make sure that our picture of Jesus is sufficiently grand. Verses 4 to 13, it's not guaranteed to be easy. Consider, 1, it hasn't yet cost you as much as it cost Jesus. And 2, you could consider any hardships you do face as the Lord disciplining you as a child whom he loves. So, verses 12 and 13, stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, and imitate the action of the tiger. Well, that's what it would have said if Shakespeare had written it. And the last few verses of chapter 12 is a magnificent exhortation to the people. I suggest you read this again out loud. Preach it to the cat or to the wall or to whoever you can get to listen, because it's good stuff. And in chapter 13 we have a concluding miscellany, directions and further encouragements. Verse 14 about the fact that we have no abiding city here, as I've got it in my head in the one translation. I well remember many years ago when my wife and I had went to the cinema to see the film that was then new, of Fiddler on the Roof, and the film ends with that very sad period of their leaving the little village of Anatievka because they're on the move. They are of the nature on the move because they're Jews. This is the kind of feeling of it. And I came out singing to myself a bit of the Brahms German Requiem, that here we have no abiding city, but are waiting for the one that is to come. I found that film made that point very strongly to me. What then about the theology of Hebrews? 2 things. Firstly, Hebrews reminds us of our dependence on our roots in the Old Testament and of our new need to see those roots afresh in the light of Jesus. And I've got 2 major examples from the book of that happening. The first concerns all the old commandments to offer sacrifices. Hebrews doesn't dismiss them as being hopelessly old-fashioned or as not travelling too well into the post-Easter culture. He respects the commandments more than that, assuming that they need to be obeyed. But he then makes the astounding claim that Jesus has satisfied all of the Old Testament sacrificial requirements, and that he's done so once and for all, done on the one occasion, and transforming by that the situation for all people of all subsequent time. And the result of that for us is that we don't have to obey all those sacrificial commandments, but that for the rest of time and beyond we can live in the good of their having been done, and that just by sticking close to Jesus. And the second example of that is about Jeremiah's prophecy of the New Covenant. The author quotes and expands that part of Jeremiah 31 at length, and uses it as his grounds for claiming that on the cross Jesus acted as both priest and victim, offering himself as the perfect sacrifice to take away sins. Without that prophecy from Jeremiah, it would look as if Jesus had made it all up himself, perhaps. But with that prophecy, it's clear that what Jesus did was in fulfillment of what the Father had planned centuries before. That's the one theme that we pick up in Hebrews about our dependence on the Old Testament and on the reinterpretation of the Old Testament. And the other theme that we can pick up from there is his writing about faith. The main lesson there is that the people whom he honours for their faith were those who never saw their hopes fulfilled, but died when what God had promised them was only partly fulfilled. That can be taken as a great encouragement to us, because as we go through life, even post-Easter as we are, it's often clear that we don't live in an ideal world and that we're not perfect inhabitants of it either. We then have to cope with our lives when we don't reach either perfection or completion in the way that we'd like to. And the letter to the Hebrews at this point says to us, in effect, hang on. The perfection and completion of our lives are in God's hands, and anyway, they are beyond our competence. So be content with leaving those issues to Him. Well, that completes our study for the moment of the letter to the Hebrews.